Hi, this is Kurt Doolittle. It's a little hot here in Lviv today. I hope you'll listen to my second video on testimonialism. This one I'm going to try to cover, how am I going to put this? The difference between testimonialism or science and a priorism. This is one for philosophers. If you're a libertarian and you're really into epistemology, this might be interesting to you. I think it's going to be a little difficult for everyone else, but I'm gonna. If you want to learn, hey, let's learn. Okay, so I'm going to put forward some propositions. All domesticatable animals are domesticatable for about 5 reasons. And all undomesticatable animals are undomesticatable for any one of them. In other words, if any one of them doesn't work, you can't domesticate the animal, like the fact that zebras bite and hold on. All human personalities are highly functional for 5 or 6 reasons. Any person that is dysfunctional all people who are dysfunctional because any one of those 5 reasons. All happy families are happy for the same 5 or 6 reasons, and all unhappy families are unhappy for any one of those 5 or 6 reasons. Now here we get to the truth part. The philosophical part is all true statements are true because of consistency in 6 dimensions. All false statements are false because of inconsistency in any one of those 6 dimensions. So this is the interesting part, is, you've got a lot of things that make something true, something domesticatable, somebody good to deal with, and some families happy. And so if we say all, we can also say that all analytically true, like mathematically or logically true, those statements correspondingly model reality because of consistency of correspondence of 6 dimensions. All analytically false statements are false because they fail to correspond to reality in any one of those 6 dimensions. Trying to think of what objections somebody's going to raise. I think I'm going to get to answering them all. So existential, or actionable, there's a reality that humans can do something inside of, is composed of only so many actionable dimensions, followed by only so many causally relatable dimensions. The next one, the true name, or most parsimonious description of any phenomenon, in a set of consistent relations at some scale of actionable utility, can be described by the number, scope, limits, relations, and relative change and actionable change of those dimensions. So what I'm trying to get across here is that we humans tend to like really simple ideal types, like it's either true or it's not, or it balances or it doesn't. But more like economics, where there's supply and demand curves, and something's true in this space. Most phenomenon we struggle with, and truth in particular, things have to be right in multiple dimensions. In other words, about multiple lines of causality to actually remain true. Now, let's take, in mathematics, when I talk about dimensions, let's take mathematics. So mathematics has, identity, there's a thing, correspondence. One of these is one of those. There is positional naming. In other words, we give things identity in multiple instances of correspondence. We have, in other words, numbers. We have arithmetic, in other words, modifications of additions and subtractions from them. We have set operations, in other words, multiplication, division. We have procedures, in other words, functions. multiple complex sets of operations that we put these through. So functions are, most of mathematics doesn't consist of numbers, it consists of functions, but we call those numbers in mathematics out of convenience. We have geometry. Geometry now begins to tell us relative position of these things. We have calculus, which is relative change of these things. Above these things, we have some combination of those dimensions. I think the one that makes people most crazy, certainly does me, is algebraic geometry, which is non-Euclidean geometry, which just means you maintain arbitrary rules, geometric rules, or axiomatic rules, or declare axiomatic rules of relations, rather than have relations formed by the 3 or 4 dimensions we think of in reality today. Boy, I hope I said that in the optimum combination of reductive but not wrong. So the same can be said for describing the universe in non-mathematical terms, in words. So just as we have constant categories in words, we can talk about actions, and because we're concerned, just as we're concerned with regularities in mathematics, in philosophy, we're concerned with our actions. And so there are only so many actionable dimensions, just as there are so many representable existentially correspondent dimensions in mathematics. Now, at some point, you got to understand that the reason we study these higher forms of mathematics is no longer that these dimensions we're adding correspond to any reality. It's that we can actually model non-geometric phenomenon, in other words, non-spatial phenomenon, using geometric representations. So you get out of the world of correspondence with reality into the world of correspondence with ideas, and this is where math gets very interesting. I tend to always prefer the operational method because I want whatever I say to be existentially possible. Whereas in the purely mathematical method, we can create things that are not existentially possible and therefore are inactionable. They can be meaningful, they can help us gain insight, but they may not be possible. So if I take my 7 propositions, I can say, therefore, there exist fundamental laws of existentially possible action and comprehension in the existing universe as it's constructed, and in my view, it must be constructed. I'm kind of very suspicious of the idea that the universe can just pop and operate by different laws. That seems kind of inconsistent with everything we discuss. We think the universe is going to be magic, and then it turns out to be pretty regular. So my suspicion is that it's going to be that way. I'm happy to be wrong in the future. Number 2, these laws are described theoretically until known, and by analogy, call axiomatically, once they are known. By convention, in other words, by honesty and truthfulness, we distinguish between declarative and axiomatic systems, in other words, analytic systems, and existential theoretic, in other words, existing real systems, in order to not claim that the axiomatic and declarative system and the theoretical and system based on laws, in other words, axioms are declarative and laws are descriptive, which we can make up axioms, we can only discover laws, not to claim that axiomatic and theoretical are identical. We don't say that the axiomatic and the theoretical are identical because they're not. We can certainly model things equally in laws and axioms, but we can't make the same claims about axiomatic and theoretic systems, laws, because the information in an axiomatic declaration is perfect. In other words, we've declared it, and in a theoretical system, when it's describing natural laws, well, the information isn't complete there. It may never be complete. I think that we might actually get to where it is someday, but we're not there yet. So we say that these two are. We don't conflate these two, and we say they're not. So. to do so if we start to get into this game, and people do this all the time, they mix metaphors, right? They mix analogies. And so you say, well, when I say that something is, when I say something theoretical is axiomatic, something axiomatic is theoretical, then I'm really just using an analogy for the purpose of communication. It's all I know, right? We can do it because I'm just confused. I don't understand the difference between these two things as a difference in properties and what's deducible from them, and I can say that I'm committing a fraud. In other words, I'm committing a fraud of wishful thinking. In other words, I'm trying to use axiomatic language on a theoretic system to say it has more authority and my argument is more compelling than it is because it's theoretical. Or likewise, that I'm trying to cast doubt on an axiomatic system by saying that it's theoretical when it's axiomatic. Well, I mean, just how things are. Doesn't work that way. So I can use anywhere from intentional fraud to error or mistake or wishful thinking to complete incomprehension of what I'm saying out of just verbal convenience. But in this world, they're not the same as what I want to get at. Now, furthermore, one of the things here we can say is, well, you're not absolved when you commit this kind of conflation. Sure, if I'm trying to meaningfully educate you by analogy, we can do that. We can inform and ideate with people by analogy however we want. That doesn't really hurt anything. But if I'm trying to convince you or to obtain your position, or I'm trying to authoritatively falsify you, in other words, I'm trying to change your state of mind, not inform you, then we can test whether you're using ignorance or error or deception by analysis of the method of argument, whether you're conducting error or ignorance, and incentives, which means fraud, including the unconscious fraud, such as justification, wishful thinking. So while we are in this whole thing of don't accuse people, this is our Western model of aristocratic put down your weapons, pursue the truth thing, and the good gentlemanly manners of Victorian debate. I mean, the truth is that a lot of things aren't so much false as they're fraudulent. And so we can find out if you're just mistaken, false, you're wishfully thinking, justifying, or you're engaged in deceit, fraud, by knowing whether which form of argument you're using and how much knowledge you have. We can usually tell you don't know that much, and whether your incentives are to obtain something or not. So if you're not trying to obtain something and trying to pursue a trade and you're just wrong, this is pretty easy to deal with. But when you're trying to construct an argument to persuade or dominate someone or deny them their argument, and you have an incentive to obtain something through this act of persuasion or dominance or denial, then it's impossible for us to tell whether you're engaging in conscious fraud or unconscious fraud. The truth is, we're really good at determining that after a while. But even logically, if we give you the benefit of the doubt, it's pretty easy to tell this by incentives. So we can tell which kind of thing you're working on. Now, we can also theorize from observation to imagination. Then to understanding from the top down. So we can look, imagine, and gain understanding. That's sort of top down. Or we can go from understanding. In other words, I know how this sort of works, but why? To imagination, to observation, and this is a bottom up. But unless we can do both, in other words, we can both construct operationally and existentially. I know how this actually works. I can do this. And we can observe it empirically and there say, well, it's consistent and it exists. Then I'm not, the operations I say happen produce an end, and I can look at an end, I can actually see that, well, it's constructed of these operations, then, well, I've got a pretty good argument there that I can make a truth claim about a theoretic or axiomatic system. But if we can't do both, then we can't say we possess the knowledge to make a truth claim about a theoretic system or an axiomatic system. Although we got to keep in mind that axiomatic systems are complete and tautological, and theoretic systems are incomplete and descriptive. So no matter what we do, you kind of want to have both. If you've got both, they sort of they cancel out the errors of each other. So now, in order to sort of do this top-down both thing, we have to cover dimensions, right? And there's more than bottom-up and top-down. So to warranty against the falsehood of any statement, we've got to perform due diligence on our free associations so we can ensure we've established consistent limits, in other words, invariant descriptions for each of those dimensions. And they are categorical consistency, which is identity consistency, logical consistency, internal consistency, empirical consistency, external correspondence, existential consistency, in other words, operational correspondence, moral consistency, in other words, voluntarily reciprocal, in other words, everything that goes on is subjectively testable voluntarily and is willful, desired. And morally consistent, I just said morally consistent, right? Moral consistent, so yes. So existentially consistent, morally consistent, and that we have determined scope by both limits and parsimony. We've established the limits where this thing fails, and we've shown that we've tried to state this as parsimoniously as possible, and we can't remove any more. Information from it and still claim that we've produced the least erroneous description possible. Now, the next thing is 5 is the empirical measurement that Taleb, the artificial intelligence researchers and people like myself are trying to figure out is how to quantify the information necessary for the human mind to form one of those free associations, to identify a pattern. See, if we can discover this unit, it will be like discovering, coming up with the equivalent of calories of heat. It'll be like the basic unit of state change in information theory. Now, my belief, and it sort of looks like Taleb is getting out there the same way from his top-down analysis, his empirical analysis, and my constructivist analysis, is that, my bottom-up look at it, is that this number looks extremely large. In other words, we have to have an awful lot of knowledge to be able to identify any kind of pattern whatsoever. And this would account for the sort of rarity of intelligence, because the amount of memory and the evolutionary and biological cost of that memory necessary to form even basic relations, so there's basic free associations, pattern recognitions, it seems to be really, really high. Whoever figures that out, that's Nobel Prize material, right? I mean, I'm certainly not going to, and as I think it's one of those things where we have to have enough information from the first generation of AI, trying and failing, to be able to come up with that number. So I want to conclude this set of statements with a therefore is that. So, this whole idea of a prioristic epistemology in social science is total nonsense. Economics is scientific. In other words, it requires us to test all these dimensions. It's not logical. Logical testing is just the bottom-up method of looking at it one way without testing the other. And you need to do both. You need to do logical construction as well as correlative external correspondence, and Mises was right to criticize him and say, well, you can't say that social science if just giving disinformation to people produces these ends. I mean, he was right about that. But that doesn't mean that economics is logical, it just means it's scientific, and that the people who were talking about external empiricism were not being scientific, they were just measuring not enough dimensions. So this is the problem is Mises, Popper, Hayek, Brigman, Brouwer, and they all had a piece of this problem, but nobody put it together in to say, well, the scientific method consists of testing in these six dimensions, and then if you survive the test of it, it's true. But everybody wants to say, well, if I have this empirical evidence, it's true, or if I have this constructive evidence, it's true. No, it doesn't matter if you have one or the other, unless you have both. And moreover, it doesn't matter if you have both if you don't have existential consistency. In other words, we can't be sure that you're not confusing adding information subjectively that actually exists. We have to test all six dimensions. How do we know that your statement doesn't? It's the one. My favorite example of limits is the neutrality of money. Well, it might be. It's logically neutral, but how can we prove it's operationally or empirically consistent? I mean, it's almost impossible. Same thing with the minimum wage. What happens is these things are really, really noisy, and the consequences end up distributed across lots and lots of phenomenon. And all we can say is the limit of this expression that money is neutral or not, and the limit of the expression of minimum wages cause increases in prices. I mean, increases in unemployment. We can prices are elastic. These things are. We can say that these are true in the sense that they're good rules of thumb, but we can't say that they have very much parsimony to them. In other words, they may be true, but they're inactionable, which may be interesting. We might be able to flip that around and say, well, if something is unactionable, then act against it. Or we could flip it, take that further and say, well, if something is actionable, that means we can act on it because the consequences will be lost in the noise. And this is where we get into this. It's actually a moral question. Which moral condition is better? The one in which we obey natural law and we let the market work itself out, when we obey the rule of law, which is we can modify an existence to shocks or problems we encounter. In other words, a form of insurance. Or we engage in discretionary law like the left wants, which is to constantly try to manipulate this thing so that it keeps everything evenly distributed regardless of the cost to the different forms of capital. So a priorism is a special case of empiricism, just as prime numbers are a special case in mathematics, and just as any set of operations that returns a natural number, and again, is a special case, just as contradiction is a special case in logic. There are many logical statements you can make, and some of them are contradictory and some aren't, and minority are contradictory. Those are special cases. Some numbers are prime numbers, they're special cases. Well, a priorism tells us special cases. I'm not denying that you can correctly deduce some special cases. I'm saying that to say that this is not an empirical statement is nonsense. As far as I know, you can't get information. There's some order. There's some number of dimensions to the universe. The human can perceive and act on some of these dimensions. I mean, we can perceive in those dimensions we can act upon. That's why we can't see heat, because it doesn't do us any good if we can't get to it. We have an actionable thing. So in the sense that there are limits to our perception, that's probably true. To say that we can make truthful deductions from this is false. To say that we can come up with theories from it is true. And to say that we can go out and finish we can come up with a theory. That theory is a prioristic. In other words, it's hard to imagine it's hard to imagine it being otherwise. And we can say that this theory is hard to. I mean, we may or may not be able to test it very easily. That doesn't mean it's false. It may mean it's just not testable by any economically possible means or instrumental means we have available. But it's just a special case. It isn't a separate thing. And no matter what you do, you're not going to get in this position where you get to say rely on justification. Because while you can make an a prioristic statement, it isn't clear you can make any deductions from an a prioristic statement. You can. There are certain cases where you can, but it isn't clear that as a general rule you can do this. No, well, you can say that within the set of special cases we can, and those special cases make sense. Outside of the special cases we can't. So I try to get across the point that, it may be good to say certain things are true, but unless we can test them on all 6 dimensions, we can't really say much about them that makes a truth claim about it. In other words, we can't be created as a law. I mean, it's not a law that money is neutral. It's not a law that prices, that unemployment, that higher minimum wages increase unemployment. It might be a general tendency. It might be a rule of thumb. It might be a rough model. It might be a sense of the way the wind blows. But it's not. It's not a candidate for a law. So. So this is what we're trying to accomplish with law. We can say, well, this is just like any other theory. So let me walk through some ideas and see if I can get this across to you. So just as like laws of triangles form a particularly useful set of special cases, we can we must understand that it's because they possess the minimum dimensions necessary for spatial descriptions, and so that's why they're really, really good. It's because of the basic unit of spatial comprehension. So, because you can't have less than that and talk about spaces. The human mind evolved to prey. So where do we get this a prioristic limit from? Well, the human mind evolved to prey upon other creatures. Unlike frogs and cockroaches, they just see the nearest dark spot and they run at it. Frogs hop at certain shaped dark spots and sizes in a certain distance, and cockroaches run at other shaped dark spots. They certainly can tell when they're in your line of vision, and they try to get outside of it, or in the line of motion where they can see motion. They just seek that, but from us, we've got to prey, and that's harder. Something's in motion, we've got to chase it down, outrun it, we've got to stick it with something, capture it, hit it with a rock, hit it with a spear, shoot an arrow at it, shoot a bullet at it. Why are we capable of doing all these things? And why are we and canines can model the destination of a thrown object, but we can model it over, when you throw it over a house? It's so hard to train my dog to go, let me throw the ball over the house and him to go realize, oh wait, this is a candidate for me having to run there because I'm not going to see it land. He doesn't know where it's landing back there. He just knows he has to run around the house to find it. So we evolved that ability to project, but we also evolved the ability to compare and choose between different routes, different things to do. And so to model one set of conditions in three-dimensional space and do another, it requires a certain amount of memory, a certain amount of comparisons to do that. And this is why we can hold about 5 things in our mind. And I'm not going to go into all the dimensions of it right here. I've worked on that elsewhere. I've elaborated the construction of why we sort of remember 5 things at once from these basic principles, but I'm going to avoid that for now. So we've evolved the ability to see within so much, and and it's basically what's actionable for us in reality. We can't model so easily those things that are inactionable for us. That's why we invent things like numbers and logic and a reason and whatever to help us break problems down into the size where we can subjectively make a comparison. That's why we develop empirical instrumentation, so that we can take measurements, so we can compare what we cannot sense. That's why we produce records, so that we record what was measured by the instruments, because we can't remember clearly enough what was done, and we tend to mush things together. So next, to a few very possibly no non-tautological, or at least non-reductio a prioristic statements really can survive scope consistency. I certainly can't find very many. Now somebody's going to go off and say, I can think of all these cases. Well, in my world, I'm trying to solve a problem of social science and law. I'm trying to solve a problem in economics because I want to falsify the immoral use of economics that we've seen over the past century. So I want to find that. We can establish free associations or hypotheses empirically, top down, or constructively bottom up. But the method of discovery puts no truth constraint on that statement. They've all got to survive all the tests of dimensions. Now, this doesn't mean, and this is where I get to the value of biprioritism and rules of thumb, it doesn't mean we can't use a partial truth. In other words, a hypothesis that doesn't survive all 6 dimensions to search for further associations. Why can't we use partial search criteria? Well, we can. Matter of fact, if you look at what we think of as certain and we use as search criteria for the purpose of obtaining something, we use a lot of stuff that isn't quite true or isn't quite law, and then we have laws that we do use because they help us in very complex things. So it's this utility in searching that we converted first to reason, second to rationalism, third to empiricism, fourth to operation, and fifth into scope consistency, and sixth into natural law or morality or voluntary cooperation, the volition that's necessary to ensure the information quality of small groups, just as like norms and laws are necessary methods of establishing limits in large groups, just as money is necessary for producing actual information in very large groups. But there's this one epistemological method, accumulate information. So there's just one so what I want to get to is we can use these rules, right? We can use them. We can say we found an a prioristic statement. We can say we can use these rules. We can say that truthfully this a prioristic finding is passes all our rules. So therefore, it passes all our rules, and now we can consider it a theory or a theory candidate or a law candidate. That's fine. We can have that. There are plenty of special cases, but there's just one epistemological method, and I don't want anybody. The reason I'm so adamant about this is that this kind of a prioristic nonsense has been used to justify every pseudoscientific deception of the 20th century. And so the reason I want to get rid of that is say, well, you could go discover what you want, make these findings, and use them to learn and to understand the universe. But the minute you're trying to move from education or understanding and opportunity, communication and understanding, and you're moving into persuasion or dominance and denial of someone else's argument, then you've got to meet a higher standard of truth. And so this higher standard of truth is what we're sort of going to. So this is the question we get. This is the problem we get into with the minimum wage debate, is that it doesn't meet the higher standard of truth. It's not a true statement. It's not a law. It's a rule of thumb, but it's not a law. You could call it a theory. But it's certainly not a law, although a question was there. I just think if it was a rule of thumb or a general rule. So there's just one method, epistemological method for mankind. It's to sort of accumulate information, identify a pattern, search for an hypothesis. We criticize that hypothesis. If we're successful, we produce a theory. We then distribute that theory. We publish it or we speak it to others, and others criticize that theory until it either fails or it survives long enough time. If it survives long enough under enough conditions, we tend to consider it a law. Once something's a sort of law, we just sort of internalize it. It develops into part of our metaphysics, and we move on. Just as we've sort of internalized. Natural law in the West. We've internalized high trust systems. We've internalized defense of the commons. We've internalized now empiricism, mostly. We're still internalizing Darwin. They're trying to internalize in us falsehoods, the pseudosciences. And I'd like it if we could someday internalize truth, so that we spoke truthfully with one another, because under truth we could exchange. But again, if we get into truth and exchange, what we're talking about is meritocracy. And a lot of people can't bear meritocracy because meritocracy is eugenic, and an awful lot of the world doesn't want, doesn't like, or prefers to work under dysgenic, in other words, rent-seeking, parasitic reproduction. So there's just one epistemological method. And there is nothing special about physical science other than that philosophy was sort of free of cost constraints. In other words, philosophers like to talk about heaven as if there's or truth without the cost being involved. Well, you get some of this in science as well, but science actually works by a cost-based method. They actually perform experiments under cost, and of course, energy transfer in nature is by cost. But in social science, we try to still use moral statements in order to avoid the problem of who's paying and how much it costs them and what the consequences are. So physical science, other than philosophy, was free of this cost constraint, but we still have held philosophy and morality by philosophy and science by moral constraints. And then sort of science evolved to where it got free of some moral constraints as well as cost constraints. A little bit, and then we get and because the substitute for cost constraints in physical science is energy cost, or the cost of transformation. Then we got into judicial law, which is cooperative and existential, and so that's empirical. We see this, and it has costs in it. So we managed to slowly assemble out of these different fields of science, cooperation, and so to flip it the other way around, about imagination, wishful thinking, hypothesizing, philosophy, law, pragmatic, what we actually do, and physics, the physical constraints of the universe. We sort of got a little bit of science out of each of those, and we slowly, over time, despite the taboos that morality and cost, or actually cost is probably part of the moral constraint, that these things pushed upon us over the centuries. We finally got rid of them till we're operating at scale. It's sort of we're not talking about in-group members, so we can sort of cheat. We can get out of that internal moral constraint. One of the things that economics has done is allowed us to sort of get an excuse where we can get out of talking about that. And so we managed to slowly assemble a sufficient understanding of what truth means in each of those disciplines, that together we can bring all those different what we learned from those disciplines together and test any proposition in any discipline: mental, philosophical, whatever, logical, cooperative, legal, exchange, moral, and physical, the physical world out there. And by the due diligence of consistency in all those dimensions, we can test everything. And so that's what testimonialism I've tried to do, is I've tried to make us test everything by the same criteria so that we can put it into law. And so we have categorical, logical, mental tests, which have operational, existential, physical tests, and we have morality and scope, which is cooperative tests. And in other words, I'm not misrepresenting myself. I'm not thinking clearly. It's correspondent with the reality, and I'm engaged in truthful and moral discourse, and that is what makes testimonialism so important. And I think of it this way: as testimonialism is everything. Right? Empiricism was a subset of testimonialism, and a priorism is a special case of empiricism. And so I tend to put that framework together. And if you don't go by that, in other words, I touched on this earlier, but if you don't do that, I have to question why. In other words, are you trying to take a discount? In other words, are you trying to make it easier for yourself? Are you trying to justify what you want to do? In other words, do you err? Are you mistaken? Do you not understand? Are you trying to take a discount, just make it easier for yourself? Are you trying to justify what you want, or are you trying to engage in an act of fraud? Now, unfortunately, your intentions don't matter here. Because, the minute you're up into incentives, your intentions don't matter. We can't tell. So you're engaging in something you shouldn't be. If you just don't know any better, you can say, I don't know any better, until you know better. But once you know better, now, what are you doing? Are you engaging in discounting, justification, fraud? So we can tell that by your incentives, which is why the completeness of truth tests matters so much. All right, I'm Kurt Doolittle. This is the Propertarian Institute. I've tried to give you a little talk on the special and testimonialism and the differences between empiricism and priorism, and how that there's just one basic epistemological method, and if you don't use it, we have to question why, because the great deceptions of the 20th century were conducted under the auspices of authoritarian empiricism and priorism, both of which are false. Thanks.